The first rays of dawn painted the Nairobi Elephant Sanctuary in soft golden hues, but there was nothing peaceful about the sound echoing through the morning air. A high-pitched, desperate trumpeting filled the silence, the kind of cry that spoke of pure heartbreak. In the nursery section, a small figure huddled in the corner of a specially designed enclosure, trembling despite the warm Kenyan morning. Django was barely 3 months old, weighing only 180 pounds, when most elephant calves his age should be closer to 250. His eyes, normally bright and curious in healthy elephant babies, were dull with exhaustion and grief. Dark circles ringed them, evidence of 2 sleepless nights since his arrival at the David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust. His tiny trunk, which should have been exploring everything with the enthusiasm typical of young elephants, hung limp at his side. Joseph Mukiri, one of the sanctuary's most experienced keepers, stood outside the enclosure with growing desperation. In his 15 years at the sanctuary, he had seen many orphaned elephants arrive in various states of trauma, but none quite like this little one. Django had not eaten properly since his rescue, refusing even the specially formulated milk that usually proved irresistible to hungry elephant calves. More concerning was his complete rejection of any comfort or care from the human keepers. The morning routine that worked with other orphans had failed spectacularly. Django would not respond to gentle coaxing, would not be soothed by the rhythmic humming that usually calmed distressed baby elephants, and showed no interest in the various toys and enrichment items that typically sparked curiosity in young minds. Instead, he remained in his corner, occasionally letting out those heart-wrenching cries that seemed far too large and sorrowful for such a small creature. The sun climbed higher, bringing with it the oppressive heat that would make the day uncomfortable for both animals and keepers. Joseph noticed how the direct sunlight was beginning to beat down on Django's corner, where the little elephant had positioned himself. Without adequate shade, the already weakened calf would become even more stressed and dehydrated. Joseph made his way to the storage shed where donated items were kept. Among the boxes of medical supplies and feeding equipment, he spotted a pile of blankets that had been donated by a local school. Most were simple cotton throws in various colors, intended to provide comfort for the youngest arrivals. He grabbed the first one his hand touched, a red blanket with bold black stripes running through it, soft from many washings and slightly faded from use. Walking back to Django's enclosure, Joseph had no grand expectations. He simply wanted to create some shade for the suffering calf, perhaps make him slightly more comfortable while they figured out how to reach him. He approached slowly, making soft clicking sounds with his tongue, a noise that usually signaled non-threatening intentions to the elephants. Django's ears flicked backward, acknowledging the human presence but not moving from his position. Joseph carefully draped the red and black blanket over one corner of the enclosure, creating a small shaded area. Then he stepped back, expecting nothing more than to have provided a bit of relief from the mounting heat. What happened next defied every expectation. Django's head lifted slowly, his trunk extending to test the air. Something had changed in the atmosphere of his small world. He rose unsteadily to his feet, those massive ears flapping once in what seemed like curiosity rather than distress. Step by hesitant step, he moved toward the corner where the blanket had been placed. His trunk, which had been hanging listlessly for 2 days, suddenly came alive with purpose. He reached out tentatively, touching the edge of the blanket with the sensitive tip of his trunk. The texture seemed to fascinate him, soft, warm from the sun, but not uncomfortably hot. He explored it further, running his trunk along the striped pattern, pressing gently against the fabric. Then, in a movement that took Joseph completely by surprise, Django wrapped his trunk around a section of the blanket and pulled it toward himself. Not roughly, not in the destructive way that stressed elephants sometimes behaved, but gently, carefully, as if he were handling something precious. The transformation was immediate and profound. The trembling that had racked his small body for days began to subside. His rigid posture relaxed. Most remarkably of all, the desperate crying stopped. For the first time since his arrival, the sanctuary was blessed with the sound of silence from Django's enclosure. Joseph watched in amazement as the little elephant maneuvered the blanket, using his trunk with surprising dexterity for one so young. Django seemed to be arranging it, spreading it partly beneath himself and partly over his back, creating a cocoon of red and black stripes. Once he had it positioned to his satisfaction, he lay down, something he had refused to do properly since his rescue. The elephant calf's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow with stress, began to slow and deepen. His eyes, though still sad, lost some of their wild, panicked look. Joseph remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell the blanket had cast. But the true magic was yet to come. As Joseph prepared to finally leave Django in peace, hoping the calf might rest, he heard a sound that made him freeze in place. It was soft, so soft he almost missed it, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years working with elephants. Django was rumbling, the low, contented sound that elephants make when they feel safe and calm. 2 days earlier, Joseph had received the call that would bring Django into their lives. A wildlife ranger in Amboseli National Park had been conducting routine patrols when he discovered something that would haunt him for weeks afterward. A small elephant calf barely 3 months old standing guard over the motionless body of an adult female elephant. The scene told a story of both devotion and tragedy. The mother elephant appeared to have been sick for some time, her body showing signs of the mysterious illness that had been affecting elephants across Kenya. Wildlife veterinarians would later determine that she had succumbed to a combination of severe malnutrition and what appeared to be a systemic infection, possibly related to the ongoing drought that had stressed the local elephant population. What broke the ranger's heart was the evidence of the calf's vigil. The ground around the mother's body was worn smooth by small feet that had paced countless circles. The calf had clearly been trying to rouse his mother, using his tiny trunk to push against her massive head, attempting to lift her trunk, trumpeting calls that went unanswered. When the rescue team arrived, Django was in a state of severe dehydration and distress. He had refused to leave his mother's side, even for water or the sparse vegetation that might have sustained him. The rescuers faced the heartbreaking task of separating him from the only family he had known, a process that required both physical restraint and emotional strength from everyone involved. The journey to the sanctuary had been traumatic for the young elephant. Unlike many orphans who gradually accepted human care, Django seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing hour. He refused bottles of specially formulated elephant milk, pushed away, offered comfort, and showed none of the natural curiosity that usually helped young elephants adapt to their new circumstances. Now, as Joseph watched the small form beneath the red and black striped blanket, he began to understand something profound about grief and healing. The blanket had become more than just fabric. It had become a bridge between Django's traumatic past and his uncertain future. The other keepers who had been struggling alongside Joseph to help Django began to gather quietly around the enclosure. Dr. Emily Carter, the sanctuary's veterinarian, approached with the careful steps of someone who didn't want to disturb a miracle in progress. She had been deeply concerned about Django's refusal to eat or rest. Elephant calves were particularly vulnerable to rapid decline when stressed, and his size and age made every hour without proper nutrition potentially life-threatening. She had been preparing more intensive intervention methods, including possible sedation to force-feed him, when Joseph had made his simple gesture with the donated blanket. What she observed now challenged many of her scientific assumptions about animal behavior and trauma response. Django's vital signs, which he could assess from his breathing pattern and general demeanor, appeared to have stabilized dramatically. More importantly, his psychological state seemed to have shifted from acute distress to something approaching calm. As the morning progressed, the sanctuary staff maintained their vigil, documenting what might prove to be a breakthrough moment. Django remained beneath his striped sanctuary, occasionally shifting position, but never straying far from the blanket's comforting embrace. His trunk, which had been such a source of concern in its listless state, now moved with purpose, constantly touching and repositioning the fabric. The most encouraging sign came when feeding time arrived. Joseph approached with a bottle of the specially formulated milk, expecting the usual refusal. Instead, Django raised his head, his trunk reaching out not in rejection, but in interest. For the first time since his rescue, he accepted nourishment. drinking deeply while keeping one edge of the blanket within reach of his trunk. 2 weeks passed, and the red and black striped blanket had become the center of Django's world in ways that amazed and sometimes frustrated the sanctuary staff. What had begun as a simple comfort measure had evolved into something far more complex and profound, an attachment so strong it redefined every aspect of the young elephant's daily routine. The blanket traveled with Django everywhere. Using his trunk with increasing skill and determination, he would gather the fabric whenever he moved from one area of his enclosure to another. Watching him maneuver the increasingly battered blanket became a source of endless fascination for both keepers and visitors. He had developed a particular technique for transport, gripping one corner with his trunk and allowing the rest to drape alongside his small body as he walked. The morning routine at the sanctuary had been completely reorganized around Django's needs. Where other elephant calves could be coaxed from their sleeping areas with food or social interaction, Django required a more complex negotiation. He would not begin his day until the blanket had been properly arranged to his satisfaction, a process that could take anywhere from 10 minutes to nearly an hour, depending on his particular mood and needs. Joseph had become expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated Django's state of mind. When the elephant calf was feeling secure, he would carry the blanket casually, almost carelessly. But when stress levels rose due to weather changes, unfamiliar sounds, or disruptions to routine, Django's grip on the fabric would tighten, and he would position himself so that the maximum amount of his body was in contact with the comforting material. The feeding routine had evolved into an elaborate ritual. Django would only accept his bottle while the blanket was positioned beneath him or draped over his back. Joseph learned to present the milk while maintaining absolute respect for the blanket's position, understanding that any attempt to move or adjust the fabric during feeding time would result in an immediate refusal to eat. Other elephant calves in the sanctuary watched these proceedings with the mild interest typical of their species. Elephants are naturally curious animals, and the presence of the red and black blanket in their midst created a focal point for observation and occasionally attempted investigation. However, Django's response to any approach toward his treasured possession was swift and unambiguous. When a slightly older female calf named Nuru attempted to examine the interesting-looking fabric with her trunk, Django's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He positioned himself between Nuru and the blanket, spread his ears wide in the classic threat display, and produced a surprisingly authoritative trumpet for such a small elephant. The message was clear. The blanket was off-limits to everyone except himself. Dr. Carter observed these interactions with growing fascination and some concern. While Django's attachment to the blanket had clearly saved his life by providing the emotional security necessary for him to eat and rest, the intensity of his possessiveness was unusual, even by the standards of traumatized animals. She consulted with elephant behavior specialists, trying to understand whether this level of attachment was healthy or potentially problematic for his long-term development. The first major crisis came exactly 3 weeks after Django's arrival. The blanket, subjected to constant handling by a growing elephant calf, was beginning to show serious signs of wear. More critically, it had developed a distinctly unpleasant odor and was becoming a potential hygiene concern. The sanctuary's protocols required regular cleaning of all materials in contact with the animals. But Django's reaction to any suggestion that the blanket be removed, even temporarily, was immediate and severe. Joseph's first attempt to negotiate a washing schedule was met with complete failure. He approached Django with a clean blanket of similar size and color, hoping to create a temporary substitution. The moment Django realized what was being proposed, he wrapped himself around his blanket with a determination that was both heartbreaking and impressive. His small body became a living barrier, protecting his most precious possession from any interference. The standoff lasted for hours. Django refused food and water, maintaining his protective position around the increasingly rumpled blanket. His distress calls, which had been absent since that first miraculous day, returned with renewed intensity. Other elephants in the sanctuary became agitated by his obvious distress, creating a ripple effect of anxiety throughout the facility. Dr. Carter faced a difficult decision. The hygiene concerns were legitimate. A dirty blanket could become a source of infection or illness. But forcing the issue might undo all the psychological progress Django had made. After consulting with the sanctuary's director and several elephant behavior specialists, she decided on a compromise approach that would test everyone's patience and creativity. The solution came from Joseph, whose years of experience had taught him to think like an elephant when solving problems. Instead of attempting to remove the entire blanket at once, he began a gradual process of sectional cleaning. While Django slept, Joseph would carefully clean small portions of the blanket using gentle, elephant-safe cleansing products, allowing each section to dry before moving on to the next. This process required extraordinary patience and timing. Joseph had to learn Django's sleep patterns with precision, understanding exactly how deeply the calf slept and for how long. Any disturbance that woke Django during the cleaning process would result in immediate and protective behavior, making it necessary to start over on another day. The gradual cleaning method worked, but it revealed the true depth of Django's attachment to his blanket. Even the slightest change in texture or scent would cause him to examine the fabric carefully with his trunk, assessing whether this was still his treasured possession or some inferior substitute. Only when he was completely satisfied that the essential character of the blanket remained unchanged would he settle back into his normal routine. As the weeks passed, the other elephant calves gradually accepted the presence of Django and his unusual companion. A social hierarchy began to develop, with Django occupying a unique position, neither dominant nor submissive, but somehow separate due to his special circumstances. The other elephants learned to respect the invisible boundary that surrounded him and his blanket, understanding through means that humans could only guess at that this small elephant had needs that were different from their own. The blanket began to show its age in ways that told the story of its importance. The original bright red had faded to a softer rose color, and the black stripes had become gray. Several small tears had appeared along the edges where Django's enthusiastic handling had stressed the fabric. Joseph performed minor repairs when possible, using thread that matched as closely as possible to maintain the blanket's familiar appearance. Django's growth during this period was remarkable. Freed from the stress that had initially threatened his survival, he began to gain weight steadily. His appetite became robust, his energy levels increased dramatically, and his natural elephant curiosity began to emerge. However, all of these positive developments occurred within the context of his relationship with the blanket. He might explore new areas of his enclosure, investigate interesting smells, or engage in play behavior, but the red and black striped fabric was always within his reach. The sanctuary's routine had adapted completely to accommodate Django's needs. Feeding schedules, cleaning protocols, and even visitor tour routes had been modified to minimize disruption to the delicate balance that kept the young elephant emotionally stable. Staff members who were new to the facility received specific training about Django's requirements, understanding that his well-being depended on maintaining respect for his extraordinary relationship with what had become known throughout the sanctuary as Django's blanket. The transformation from the traumatized, nearly lifeless calf who had arrived weeks earlier was profound. Where once there had been a creature consumed by grief and fear, there was now a growing young elephant with personality, preferences, and a zest for life. The catalyst for this remarkable change remained draped over his back or clutched in his trunk, a simple piece of fabric that had somehow become the foundation for a new life. 18 months had passed since that first miraculous morning when Django discovered his blanket, and the transformation was extraordinary to witness. What had once been a frail, traumatized calf weighing barely 180 pounds had grown into a robust young elephant approaching 500 pounds of solid muscle and boundless energy. His tusks were beginning to show, tiny ivory points that hinted at the magnificent animal he would become. His coordination had improved dramatically, and he moved with the confident gait of a healthy elephant calf who had learned to trust his environment. Yet through all this growth and change, one constant remained. The red and black striped blanket that had saved his life continued to be his most treasured possession. The contrast was now almost comical. A blanket that had seemed appropriately sized for a tiny orphan now appeared almost doll-like in comparison to Django's substantial frame. When he carried it with his trunk, it looked like a pocket handkerchief in the grasp of his powerful appendage. The blanket itself bore the scars of 18 months of constant companionship. The original vibrant red had faded to a pale salmon color, and the black stripes had become a soft charcoal gray. Multiple repairs were visible across its surface, creating a patchwork of slightly different colored threads where Joseph had carefully mended tears and worn spots. One corner had been completely reconstructed after a particularly enthusiastic play session had reduced it to threads. Dr. Carter had been documenting Django's development meticulously, and his progress reports read like a case study in successful trauma recovery. Physically, he had exceeded every milestone for healthy development. Emotionally, he had learned to form bonds with his human caregivers and had even begun to show interest in socializing with the other elephant calves, though always with his blanket nearby. Behaviorally, he demonstrated all the curiosity, playfulness, and intelligence expected of a young elephant his age. However, as Django approached his second birthday, conversations at the sanctuary had begun to focus on his future. The goal of every elephant orphan program was eventual reintegration into the wild, and Django's age was approaching the optimal time for beginning the transition process. Young elephants who remained in human care too long could become too habituated to human contact, making successful wild release impossible. The Tsavo National Park Integration Program had been highly successful with previous sanctuary graduates. Young elephants were gradually introduced to the park environment while maintaining access to supplemental feeding and human support. Over months or years, depending on the individual, they would join wild herds and eventually become completely independent. But Django presented a unique challenge that had never been encountered in the program's history. What to do about the blanket? The debate among the sanctuary staff was intense and heartfelt. Some argued that forcing separation from the blanket would be tantamount to re-traumatizing Django, potentially undoing all the progress he had made. Others worried that allowing him to take the blanket into the wild would mark him as fundamentally different from other elephants, possibly making it difficult for him to be accepted by wild herds. Dr. Carter found herself in the difficult position of making a recommendation that could profoundly affect Django's future. She had consulted with elephant behavior specialists around the world, but none had encountered a case quite like this. The attachment Django had formed to the blanket was far beyond normal comfort-seeking behavior. It had become an integral part of his identity and coping mechanism. Observations of Django's behavior provided clues about his emotional state and attachment patterns. During times of stress, thunderstorms, equipment noise, or disruptions to routine, his first response was always to seek out his blanket. When content and relaxed, he would often play with it, tossing it in the air with his trunk or draping it over logs and rocks in elaborate arrangements. Most tellingly, his sleep patterns remained completely dependent on the blanket's presence. Without it, he would not rest properly, reverting to some of the anxious behaviors that had characterized his early days at the sanctuary. The decision ultimately came down to a philosophical question about the nature of healing and adaptation. Dr. Carter decided that if the blanket had been crucial to Django's survival and recovery, then it should remain part of his transition to independence. The welfare of the individual elephant took precedence over concerns about conventional reintegration procedures. Preparations for Django's move to Tsavo began with careful attention to maintaining his comfort and security. A special transport vehicle was arranged with plenty of space for both Django and his blanket. The timing was planned to minimize stress, with a journey scheduled for cooler morning hours and the most experienced keepers assigned to accompany him. Joseph, who had become Django's primary caregiver and the person most familiar with his needs, would oversee the initial transition period at Tsavo. His presence would provide continuity and familiarity while Django adjusted to his new environment. Most importantly, Joseph understood the critical role of the blanket and would ensure that this vital relationship was protected during the vulnerable transition period. The actual move went more smoothly than anyone had dared to hope. Django with his blanket securely gripped in his trunk, showed the same curiosity about his new surroundings that he had gradually developed at the sanctuary. The Tsavo landscape, with its red earth and scattered acacia trees, seemed to awaken something deep in his genetic memory. His trunk worked constantly, testing new scents and exploring unfamiliar textures. The first night in Tsavo was the crucial test. Would Django be able to rest in this completely new environment, even with his blanket? As darkness fell, Joseph watched anxiously as the young elephant explored his new enclosure, the faded red and black fabric trailing behind him like a security flag. When Django finally settled down to sleep, he followed the same ritual that had comforted him for 18 months. He arranged the blanket carefully, positioning it both beneath and partially over himself. The familiar rumbling sound that indicated contentment began almost immediately, and within minutes he was sleeping peacefully under the vast African sky. 2 years later, Dr. Carter received a report that filled her with profound satisfaction and wonder. Django, now a magnificent 4-year-old elephant weighing over 200 pounds, had successfully integrated into a small group of other orphaned elephants in Tsavo. He had learned to forage effectively, had developed social bonds with his peers, and showed every sign of successful adaptation to wildlife. The report included a remarkable detail. Django still maintained a special sleeping area in a rocky outcrop where he kept the remnants of his beloved blanket. The fabric was now little more than a collection of faded threads. But he continued to seek it out when he needed comfort or security. During severe weather or times of stress, he would return to his special cave and settle down with whatever remained of the red and black stripes that had once saved his life. Most remarkably, other elephants in his group had learned to respect this ritual. They understood through the complex social intelligence that characterizes elephant society that Django had needs that were different from their own. His blanket cave was accepted as his personal space, approached by others only when specifically invited. The implications of Django's story extended far beyond a single elephant's successful rehabilitation. His case demonstrated the profound importance of emotional security in trauma recovery, not just for humans, but for other intelligent social species. It showed that healing could take unexpected forms and that successful adaptation didn't always mean conforming to typical behavioral patterns. Research teams studying Django's development identified several key factors that contributed to his successful transition. The consistency of care during his early recovery period had been crucial. The gradual, respectful approach to managing his attachment had allowed him to maintain his coping mechanism while developing new skills and relationships. Most importantly, the decision to honor rather than challenge his unique needs had created a foundation of trust that supported all other aspects of his growth. Scientists studying attachment behaviors in elephants found Django's case to be groundbreaking. Elephants were already known for their complex emotional lives and strong social bonds, but Django's relationship with an inanimate object demonstrated new dimensions of their psychological sophistication. His ability to transfer security and comfort from a living relationship to a symbolic one, and then to maintain that relationship while developing new social connections, revealed cognitive and emotional capabilities that were previously unrecognized. The story also highlighted the importance of individualized approaches to wildlife rehabilitation. While standardized protocols were necessary for most cases, exceptional circumstances required exceptional solutions. Django's success challenged assumptions about what constituted appropriate preparation for wild release and demonstrated that emotional welfare was as crucial as physical health in determining an animal's ability to thrive. Today, the techniques developed during Django's rehabilitation have been incorporated into elephant orphan programs worldwide. Caregivers are trained to recognize and respect unusual attachment behaviors, understanding that these may be adaptive responses to trauma rather than problematic dependencies. The principle that healing must be honored in whatever form it takes has become a cornerstone of modern wildlife rehabilitation philosophy. Django's blanket, though now reduced to mere threads, remains one of the most powerful symbols in conservation history. It represents the profound connection between comfort and survival, the healing power of security, and the remarkable resilience of life when given appropriate support. More than anything, it demonstrates that sometimes the smallest gestures, placing a simple blanket in the right place at the right time, can create miracles that echo across years and transform lives in ways that no one could have predicted. The science behind Django's attachment revealed fascinating insights into elephant psychology and trauma response. Researchers discovered that elephants, like many highly intelligent social mammals, can form what psychologists term transitional attachments, emotional bonds with objects that serve as bridges between traumatic experiences and healthy relationships. In Django's case, the blanket had essentially functioned as a substitute mother figure, providing the constant comfort and security that his biological mother could no longer offer. Studies of elephant behavior in the wild showed that calves maintain almost constant physical contact with their mothers for the first several years of life. This contact provides not just physical warmth and protection, but crucial emotional regulation. When Django's mother died, he lost not only a source of food and protection, but also his primary means of managing stress and anxiety. The blanket had somehow filled this vital role, allowing his nervous system to regulate properly and his development to continue along healthy pathways. The broader implications for wildlife conservation and animal welfare were profound. Django's story demonstrated that successful rehabilitation required attention to psychological as well as physical needs. It showed that animals could form meaningful relationships with inanimate objects when those objects provided essential emotional functions. Most importantly, it proved that unconventional approaches to care could yield extraordinary results when they addressed the specific needs of individual animals. The red and black striped blanket that had begun as a simple donation from a local school had become a testament to the power of compassion, understanding, and respect for the complex emotional lives of the animals we share this planet with. In saving one small elephant, it had taught the world invaluable lessons about healing, attachment, and the remarkable resilience of life when supported with wisdom and patience.